My name is Michael Reid, and I'm the Americas editor of The Economist. I'm sitting here with Professor Francis Fukuyama of Stanford University. Professor Francis Fukuyama, you are a man who spent a lot of your early years in your professional life studying the Soviet Union, and then you moved on to sort of global megatrends. So how did you come to get interested in Latin America? When did that happen, and why did it happen?
Well, one thing is the subject that I was working on, the Soviet foreign policy, disappeared as a subject in 1989.
So you were out of
so
work.
I had to look for a new job or a new occupation. But the Latin American interest was completely fortuitous. I just started getting, after I wrote The End of History, I started getting invited down to the region. And over the last 30 or 25 years, I'd say I've been to Latin America more than any single other part of the world. I didn't learn anything in school formally about it, so I'm completely self-taught, and as a result of just visiting and talking to people from the region. But I just find it, well, there's several things I like. First of all, as a comparativist, if you're interested in democracy, that's where all the world's democracies are. And so if you want to see both the potential, and that was something very hopeful in that period, that you had the third wave and a lot of it was happening in Latin America, getting beyond dictatorship. If you wanted to see, some of the not so nice sides of democracy, like clientelism and political corruption, that was also a laboratory for it.
How do you judge the progress and prospects for of democracy in the region? I mean, there's always a lot of concern about kind of the low quality of democracy. It may be directly threatened only in one or two places in the region, but in many other countries, it's there, but it's got many faults. I mean, how do you judge that?
Well, right, this is one of those glass half empty, half full things. I tend to look at the half full side of it. One fact that I think is really remarkable, so you've had three presidents who've stepped down after, in some cases, 2 terms. So you've got Lula in Brazil, Bachelet in Chile, and Uribe in Colombia, who left office with favorable ratings of 70–80%. So name me the last American president or European prime minister who has left office with that kind of popularity. And these were not populist demagogues. These were serious people that did serious things. And so in some sense, you don't have democratic success like that anywhere else in the world. On the other hand, there are clearly things to worry about because, for example, press freedom, the tendency of governments to manipulate information, return to nationalization like we've seen in Argentina. So some of these old trends in that region have really not disappeared. And if that's happening when times are this good, then you obviously worry if we get into a new big global downturn, whether things won't get a lot worse.
In your latest book, you highlight the importance of the rule of law in the development of human societies and the development, eventually, of democracy. And Latin America is not well known for the rule of law. There's been a lot of academic work, rather pessimistic academic work, that suggests that the Iberian corporatist legacy has kind of doomed the region to a situation in which decisions are taken on the basis of political favor or discretion rather than the rule of law. I mean, to what extent, and what's your view of that issue in the region?
Well, there's a strong tradition of law that the Spanish brought with them to the New World. I think the problem is really not the rootedness of law, it's actually the inequality. Because so many of these countries have also had the legacy, the Spanish legacy of highly maldistributed income, often stratification based on racial lines, political systems run by narrow oligarchies. Even though they had this legal tradition, people with wealth and power realized that they could get away with murder, literally, because of their positions, and this becomes then a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think one of the hopeful developments is actually economic growth that brings with it the development of a broader middle class, people who have an interest in law. So if you're a middle class person, you've got a consumer durables or a house, all of a sudden you've got an interest in property rights because you don't want the government to arbitrarily take those things away from you. And I think that in the end, if the rule of law is really going to be rooted, it has to be rooted in the self-interest of a broad part of the society saying everybody has to play by the same rules. And so I think you can see the beginnings of this happening.
There's a lot of excitement in the region about the growth of the middle class. Mm-hmm. You've written about this and the importance of distinguishing between an economic measure of mm-hmm. being middle class and a sociological measure. Perhaps you could explain what you mean by that and what the relationship between the growth of the middle class and democracy might mm-hmm. be in mm-hmm. the region.
Well, the economists just measure middle class status by your income, and so sometimes they say if you're 1.5 times the poverty line, you're middle class, or some absolute measure. The lowest is I've seen is like $5 a day income, and I think that is really very inadequate because first of all, the relative measures change from country to country depending on what the average income is, but furthermore, it doesn't really tell you anything about your political inclinations. And so I think the alternative way of looking at middle class status is the way that sociologists have traditionally looked at it, which has to do with occupational status, level of education, whether you're urbanized or rural. Education of those is probably the single most important measure, because somebody that has a high school or a university education politically behaves completely differently from a illiterate peasant or an illiterate, urban poor. And so that's why I think we need to really ask questions when we talk about the rise of the middle class. How much of that actually reflects real changes in the way that people work, where they occupy a place in the social division of labor, and therefore how they think about themselves and their relationship to the government.
A lot of the economic progress in the region in the last few years has been linked to the industrialization of China and of Asia and the consequent high commodity prices. It's reasonable to assume that this commodity super cycle will draw to a close sometime in the next 5 years or so. And to carry on growing fast, the region needs to do much more to lift productivity and deal with competitiveness issues and so on. Now, those things are more complicated to do than just sort of top-down macroeconomic reform. How do you think that public policymakers in the region should go about that task, and are they going about it in the right way?
Well, okay, the first answer that everyone gives, which is clearly a right answer, is education, because compared to East Asia in particular, Latin America scores abysmally. But now that a lot of countries are actually achieving a lot of their Millennium Development Goals in terms of just getting kids into school, there's a broad realization that there's a huge quality problem, that just the fact that you complete a certain level of schooling does not actually mean that you have the skills that make you competitive. And even at the higher levels, universities, there's some excellent universities throughout Latin America, but do they actually have the capability of producing entrepreneurs, people with the high-tech skills that can actually innovate, can really raise productivity? That requires something other than just having a university. The university has to have the ties to the private sector. There has to be a willingness to flow information and human resources and all those sorts of things. And so that's, I think, really the next challenge is the quality challenge. And there you run smack into a big political problem, because all of the institutions that provide education have a lot of entrenched interests supporting them. And if you're going to change them, you're going to hurt those interests. And that's a challenge that relatively few politicians in the region have been willing to take on.
Yeah, because one of the big deficits in Latin America is in science and technology and innovation generally. I mean, if governments concentrated on getting the education side right, do you think scientific and technological progress would flow from that, or are there other things that they should be doing as well?
Well, if you look at how it happened in the United States, it's a combination of things. I mean, basically it comes, I think, out of the educational system. I teach at Stanford, and one of the reasons that Stanford was able to spawn Silicon Valley was that the school itself had a very open attitude towards the private sector. It didn't matter if professors were starting companies or making money on the side using things that they'd patented at Stanford. And so you need that kind of a new way of looking at academic achievement. But in some sense, governments need to do a bit more than that, because if there's not the infrastructure, if there's not a kind of facilitative environment of public goods that promote companies starting, then all the human capital in the world isn't going to stay. It's going to flee to some other jurisdiction where all that exists.
But can governments create clusters, or they can merely help them to come into being? How do they know where to direct their efforts?
Yeah, I think that the experience in creating clusters de novo is pretty bad. But the thing that has struck me is that there are pockets of technical and technological excellence all over Latin America. It's just that you go and look in any detail why they don't develop, more strongly. There's always some kind of an obstacle, usually a politically linked obstacle, standing in the way. So I think it's not up to the governments to make these decisions. It's really to actually find out what's going on in their own societies and to foster things that are bubbling up from the ground.
In the end of history, you argued that that liberal democracy had won the last great ideological battle in Latin America, and then Hugo Chavez came along. How do you judge the phenomenon of the Bolivarian revolution and its ramifications in the region, and how long-lived do you think it might be?
Well, actually, Hugo Chavez, as he was rising politically, actually criticized me directly, and when he was asked, he said, "There's no end of history. What there is Chavismo." Yeah, I mean, that I think that's been such a disaster for Venezuela. I mean, that's not a real alternative. I think, however, that the mere fact that you have a market-oriented, capitalist, democratic system does not actually guarantee social stability, because, as Latin America demonstrates, unless there is a degree of substantive social equality and economic equality, democratic systems tend not to work very well, precisely because you get populism and polarization and the kinds of things that we've seen in a lot of the ALBA countries. And so I think democracy actually needs to be supplemented by some attention to the problem of inclusion, access, for poor people, programs that really bring them along. And I think one of the hopeful things in this region is that that's actually been on the agenda of a lot of important countries over the last decade.
But that populist road represented by Chavismo would in the end be rendered irrelevant, let's say, by successful reformist examples.
Well, hopefully, again, one of the biggest political developments in the region, I think, is the rise of a center-left in places like Chile and Brazil. The problem classically has been that you only had an extreme left, which then promoted an extreme conservative right in reaction. But if you have a left-wing government that actually cares about redistribution, cares about the poor, thinks about a social agenda, but also realizes that you have to have growth and you have to have a market-based system that produces growth, then that's actually a formula for a sustainable attack on poverty. I think, the problem with Chavismo is not that he cares about poor people, it's that he's going about it in an extremely inefficient, and unsustainable way.
Yeah. Do you think there are any political implications from the growing economic ties between the two regions?
I think actually the role of China has been very ironic. I don't think the danger is of the sort that exists in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Chinese will corrupt or bribe officials. I mean, Latin America is just too sophisticated for that. In a sense, the real problem is that they are recreating dependencia. Because if you remember back to the 1960s, the charge that the dependencia theorists made against the North was that they were turning Latin America into just commodity producers, that they were hogging all the high value-added manufacturing and deindustrializing the region. And in a sense, that's kind of what China has done over the last decade, especially with the undervalued renminbi. So you get all these maquilas closing all over Central America, a lot of that production moving to Asia, and then this big commodity-fed boom that doesn't actually create value added in terms of skills and the kinds of things that you need to have a more diversified economy. And so I think that's really the threat, the long-term threat that China has posed. And then having gotten rich in that particular fashion, when the Chinese economic model slows down, as is it's guaranteed to do because the model simply will not go on forever, then in a sense you haven't made that much progress because you really haven't created the higher level skills and industries that you need to survive in a world where commodities aren't as valuable.
In this world, is it possible to continue developing without a significant and competitive industrial sector?
I don't think so. Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by develop, because clearly, as the last decade has shown, you can go on for, quite a number of years, and that's positive. It's better to do that than to not grow or to stagnate. But I think that the world is changing in a lot of ways, and so even in China, jobs are moving away to lower cost areas, and they've got to face the problem of how to get into this higher income status. And certainly a commodity-led period of growth is really not, that's not a long-term solution, and particularly you'll never get out of middle income status if that's all you produce. You really have to have the high-tech, high value-added skills and that's really what raises your income up to developed world standards.
Can Latin America in any way be complacent about what's going on in the rest of the world? Does it have the scope to avoid a new recession of its own, or not?
Well, it may not be able to avoid a new recession if all of its trading partners are going into recession. It's going to be quite an achievement if it manages that. I think the bigger danger is political, though. One of the reasons I think that Latin America is so healthy right now is it's had good models. It's had Europe and America that were stable democracies that seemed to be managing macroeconomic policy well, but both of those regions don't look so good in the year 2012. And the United States got into an unnecessary war in the Middle East and then had this huge financial meltdown. European Union institutions are clearly have produced this enormous crisis, and it doesn't look like they know how to get out of it. And so the prestige, I think, of being a modern market-oriented democracy is just nowhere near what it was 10 years ago. And that's what really, I think, worries me.